Hi, this is Dan Bullard, retired electronics engineer, sitting out here on the Multnomah Channel. I think I'm over by Fort William Bend again. Little Ambition's tied up back here. She's just hanging on my anchor, buddy. She'll be fine, I think. It's story time out here, so I want to tell you about Chapter 2 of Distortion. And harmonics is pretty much the same. They're basically the same. Now, before this, you've read Chapter 1, but maybe not. Anyway, so the point is that you already know about square waves and the harmonics that they generate. And so if you have a 50% duty cycle square wave, you get a spectrum that is 1 over the harmonic number, okay? That's the amplitude for 50% duty cycle square wave. Only odd harmonics, 1 over the harmonic number. So harmonic number 1, the fundamental, has an amplitude of 1, or normalize it to 1. The second harmonic doesn't exist. The third harmonic has an amplitude of 1/3. The fifth harmonic has an amplitude of 1/5, and so on. Okay, so you know that. And you also know the formula for predicting the harmonics based on the duty cycle. And that's something I came up with, me, and if you remember another video I did of a guy on Analog Heaven who came up with something that was close. I finally got the right answer. Now, what happens if you have virtually no pulse, right? A single impulse, right? And I've talked about this before. Paul Botsford at Credence believed that an impulse was the best way to measure a filter because it had an absolutely flat response. And that's true. An impulse does have an absolutely flat response. The problem is an impulse is infinitely narrow. And so it has a terrible peak to RMS ratio. Terrible. And so there's almost no energy. And the energy that does come through is in one place, and that's it. And so, you know, as time goes on, you're going to get noise, and the noise is going to overwhelm your impulse. So you can't have that. But it does have absolutely flat response, and that's a good thing. The problem is the peak to RMS ratio is pretty terrible. Now, I mentioned in another video, periodic white noise is a way to get around that. My article, It's All in the Noise for Evaluation Engineering, explains how you use periodic white noise to measure a filter the right way. But never mind. Let's talk about harmonics of square waves and triangle waves. Now, the reason why you can't make the pulse wider is if you make the impulse wider, and here's my pulse, that creates a 13-point wide pulse, so the impulse is no longer infinitely narrow. But what that does, of course, is it causes the harmonics to roll off in a very subtle and maybe not so obvious way. There's no way to fix it. There's no way. Unlike my other routines, my periodic white noise, or my other routine that I failed to mention, one of the really cool things about it is when I did the TCF test, where I had 1 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz, and so on. I had all those guys lined up. But what I didn't mention is I randomized the phases. Okay? So I could get away from the terrible peak to RMS ratio that we get with the impulse. And so by randomizing the phases, you can optimize them, but that's not really a smart way to go because you don't really know what your device is going to do to the signal. It could phase shift something and suddenly you're clipping, so you don't want that. But if you try to make the pulse wider, it rolls off the signal, and you cannot fix it. You can't fix it. There's no way to fix it. The only way to fix it is to make the pulse narrower. Okay, so, and we've seen the formula for duty cycle for calculating the harmonics based on duty cycle, and that was really cool. Okay, triangle waves. We get into triangle waves, and I talk about cathode ray tubes, if you remember those, these screens you used to look at. Cathode ray tubes were steered, the electron beams inside were steered with either electric fields or magnetic fields. The electric field was pretty easy to deal with. The magnetic field was a bit trickier because you had to deal with a couple of other issues. But when you used either one, you put in a ramp to drag the trace across the screen and then go back and drag it across the screen and then go back and drag it across the screen. And I even mentioned an episode of Star Trek in here where you see how the really slow scopes looked when they did the drag back. Okay, now the first one we look at is a triangle wave. And so a 50% triangle wave, there's no duty cycle with triangle wave. 50% duty cycle or 50% triangle wave means that half the time is going up and half of the time is going down. And so when you do that, you get an interesting pattern. It looks similar to what we saw before with the square wave, but it's not. And it comes out to be 1 over the harmonic number squared. Okay? And that's the formula for how that works. 1 over the, you have to, it depends on the duty cycle or on the pulse width and all that stuff. But if it's a 50% rise and fall, then it's 1 over the square of the harmonic. Unlike the square wave, which is 1 over the harmonic number. So with the triangle wave, it's 1 over the square of the harmonic number. You can see where this is going. Okay. Now, if we change the rise to fall time, and here I do one at 60%, so 60% TR over TT, triangle wave, and you can see what that does to the spectrum. All of a sudden, the even harmonics come up. That's because the waveform is asymmetrical in time, not in voltage, in time. And that's just like a square wave. A square wave cannot be asymmetrical in voltage. It can't be. But it can be asymmetrical in time. So if it's asymmetrical in voltage or in time, even harmonics come up. And so that tells you that some of these other guys, Audio Precision, these other guys that talk about asymmetry, they're barking up the wrong tree. The asymmetry is in the voltage or in time. And so here I skew it in time and I get even harmonics. So I didn't have even harmonics before when I did a 50% rise fall. Okay, then I do the next one, which is a 70% rise fall, and there's the spectrum, and you'll notice the spectrum looks different. Notice it's still kind of got an interesting pattern to it, and that's kind of fun. There's a pattern there, and that's defined by the sine function in the formula for triangle waves. Okay, then we go to a 90% T rise over T fall, and here's the pattern of the spectrum, and it really is beautiful. So you get odd and even harmonics with this really cool pattern, and I see 10 humps here, 10 humps. So there are 10 humps, and this is, again, a 90% rise fall time. Okay, now I'm going to go to a 99% rise fall time, and there is the spectrum. So it spends very little time going low, and the spectrum includes a whole bunch of odd and even harmonics, but it has that same weird shape. That is the last hump of those 10 humps we saw before. So what happened was the number of humps is going down as we get closer to 100% rise fall time. So, gee, I wonder what will happen when I go to 100% rise fall time. So I do that, I generate the time domain wave, and then I do the FFT and take a look. It's got a really interesting look to it, You've seen it before, and that is the spectrum, the same kind of spectrum you get from a square wave, but it includes even harmonics. Here, the harmonics fall off at 1 over the harmonic number, just like they did for the square wave. But everything is 6 dB lower. Now, what is 6 dB? What does 6 dB represent? Okay, for you, like, I don't know, I hate to say college graduates, but if you remember college and stuff, they would tell you that 3 dB is a half power point. 3 dB is half power point. So you're supposed to remember that. Well, that's the half power point, but that's not the half voltage point. Okay, power and voltage are not the same entity, and it gets really tricky at times. But 6 dB is what you get for half voltage. The problem is, if you reduce the voltage by half going to a resistor, you don't reduce the power by half, right? You've reduced it a lot more than that. You've reduced it by the square, because what is power? It's voltage squared over resistance. So you got to be careful about that. 6 dB when you're dealing with voltage for a 2-to-1 factor, okay? For power, it's 3 dB, but for voltage, it's 6 dB, and that's because voltage and power are very different. Okay, so my triangle wave spectrum looks a lot like my square wave spectrum, except that the square wave spectrum is exactly 6 dB higher. But the difference is the square wave spectrum does not have any even harmonics because it's symmetrical in time. Where did those even harmonics go? Right? Did they magically disappear? No, they're still there. Remember Blurred Laws of Harmonics number 3, that the even harmonics cancel each other out. And so that's what's going on here. The even harmonics are canceling out. So the odd harmonics are twice as big as they were before, but the even harmonics are gone. Now, why would that be? Okay, so, oh, and and here's the amplitudes for harmonic number 1. For 50% duty cycle square wave, we have 1 volt, and for a 100% TR over TT triangle wave, we have 1 volt. The second harmonic, which I color-coded red here, has no value for square waves, but for a 100% TR over TT triangle wave, it has an amplitude of 0.5, that is 1 over 2, 1 over the second harmonic. The third harmonic has an amplitude of 0.333, and for the triangle wave, we have an amplitude of 0.333 for the third harmonic. So a triangle wave, a ramp wave, if you will in this case, falls off at the same rate as a square wave. The harmonics fall off at the same rate as a square wave. And the square wave would show even harmonics too if it weren't symmetrical, right? There is the energy there for even harmonics, but they get canceled out. And how do we know this? Well, because what is a ramp wave? A ramp wave is one slope going up very slow and then one slope going down very fast. Very fast. How fast? Well, as fast as you can get it, the same speed you could do with a square wave. So the square wave has 2 fast edges. The triangle wave only has 1. It's asymmetrical in time. In time. And so what's going on there is that because the distortion is twice as big as it was, there's not just one edge anymore. There are 2 edges going from a triangle wave to a square wave. There's 2 edges. So the odd harmonics double up, right? They go up by 6 dB. But the even harmonics go away. Why? Because there were even harmonics for the edge going up in one phase or one polarity, and there were a bunch going down in the opposite polarity. So those harmonics cancel out. And so there are no even harmonics in a square wave because there are two edges that are symmetrical out of phase. Okay, that's what's going on. Okay, so it's 50% duty cycle, gives you exactly half or gives you twice of what's in a 100% TR over TT, rise time over total time triangle wave. It's exactly the same pattern. Okay, now what this does tell you is that A, law 1 is true. Bullard laws of harmonics number 1 is true because the ramp or the ramp wave has 1/2 of the area of a square wave, and so the amplitudes of the harmonics are 1/2 the amplitude of the triangle wave or the square wave. So the triangle wave amplitudes are 1/2, but it does have even harmonics because it's asymmetrical. The symmetry kills the even harmonics. So that's what's going on with the even harmonics. Now, this allows you to believe in law 1 and law 3, okay? So chapter 2 does convince you that law 1 and law 3 are true, right? Now, chapter 3 is going to do something very similar to you, and you won't see it coming. You will not see it coming, and it'll whack you over the head, and you'll go, oh my God, I can't believe it. How come I never saw that before? But remember, it's a square wave has two edges, two very fast edges, so it has twice as much energy as a ramp wave, which only has one edge. But the ramp wave has the even harmonics. So if you add up the total energy in the spectrum, the ramp wave's going to win. That's kind of weird because the ramp wave has all those even harmonics that the square wave didn't have. So the triangle wave, the ramp wave, is going to win. Okay, triangle waves and square waves very closely related. All waves are related. That's the whole point of chapter 2. And Fourier told us exactly what's going on. We don't have to guess. We don't have to make stuff up. Everywhere you go, you see stuff made up. Okay, so that's the end of story time. That's chapter 2 of Distortion. Okay, and I tell you what, this book, it's very underrated because it walks you right through the thought process, and I think it's phenomenal. I think about how much more I know now after all the experiments I've done. I could not reproduce Distortion. It's the finest product I've ever produced, and I think you'll be amazed. It'll teach you the right way to think. Anyway, that's it from the river. This is Dan Bullard. See you later.